Today, I'd like to talk about some of the pillars of caste from Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste, in terms of the different ways that people have been repressed and put down in our society, also in India and Germany, sort of some common elements of that. The fifth pillar that Isabel Wilkerson talks about in her book is what we call the division of labor, kind of a strict division of labor based on where one is on in the particular caste system, and it's kind of a hierarchy that's established. We see a severe occupational deprivation in the black community. We also see it among the untouchables in India. Blacks were barred from many trades for many years. They traveled from the south up to the north, and when they got up to the north, their job opportunities, unfortunately, were limited. Many of the different skilled trades, they just were not allowed to enter into those trades. In 1890, for example, 85% of black men and 96% of black women were engaged in only two occupations, agriculture and domestic service. So you can see it was very limited in terms of the opportunities that were available for blacks in America. Uh, and even today, when you analyze it, it's very interesting that 17 of the 20 top black earners are in entertainment or in sports. And of course, this was brought out in terms of even the entertainment industry. One time the emphasis on the black face in terms of putting on that face and kind of restricting the area where a black person could make money in terms of their occupation. The sixth pillar that Wilkerson talks about is dehumanization and stigma. For example, Germans blamed Jews for the loss of World War One. We also had, of course, the slave auctions where people would actually bid on the different slaves that were offered for sale. And in our own time, we've had this tendency to criminalize blacks and incarcerate blacks at an unbelievably higher rate than the white population. And in some areas where they were committing the same crimes, like, for example, with regard to drugs and drug abuse, we know that whites would have committed that at about the same rate or even sometimes a slightly higher rate than blacks, but yet blacks were criminalized and incarcerated at a much higher rate. Um, we also saw that in terms of some of the experiments that were done. The experiments were done on blacks in terms of the syphilis experiments and things of that nature. And so it led, of course, blacks to lose a lot of trust even in our medical system, which we see a problem even today. So this tendency to dehumanize, to say that these people, because of the color of their skin, were of a different caste, a different race, they should be put down at a lower level than those who were white. And we saw the same thing in the caste system in India. We saw the same thing with the Nazis and with regard to the Jews during the Second World War. Now, the seventh pillar, and really one of the crucial pillars, is the enforcement. So you have this sense of caste. Well, how are you going to enforce it? How are you going to make it a reality? And the way you do it, of course, is by terror. In America, the terror was done by the whip. So people were whipped and abused, and if you got out of line, you were whipped. You were whipped for small offenses, and so this whole system was based on terror. Even in terms of the Native Americans and how they were treated. Native Americans were skinned, and some of that was made actually into bridle reins for horses. So again, you're taking a human being and this whole sense of dehumanizing and this sense of this reign of terror that if you get out of line, this is going to be the consequence. And so that kind of kept the caste system going, one of the important pillars of it. Andrew Jackson, for example, who is known, of course, for the Trail of Tears in terms of the way he treated Native Americans, he used bridle reins made from the skin flesh of Native Americans. So you're saying, well, why would somebody do that? So dehumanize another person and do this terrible, awful thing to them. Again, the sense of terror. You're sending a message that if you do something, you're going to, get out of line even a little way. There are going to be consequences, and the consequences are going to be awful for you. So you just kind of stay, kind of go along with the system, with your place in the caste. African Americans, for example, were burned alive into the 20th century if they got out of line. So that was the way they were treated, hung up on a tree sometimes, and there were, of course, the lynchings, but also people who literally were burned alive. Also, there was a use of the slaves to kind of moderate the other slaves. So there'd be a slave that would be put in a position over the other slaves, and he would be the one who would enforce the terror on the other slaves. There was castration, the lynching, and this extreme punishment for even minor offenses, which we know unfortunately continues into our own day, that sometimes there's a minor enforcement, traffic violation, grass being too high, and all of a sudden, there's a huge punishment for that. So this whole sense of inequity that was built into that, and of course, that's that sense of terror. And so, because you are going to enforce it with terror, that's an intimidation factor, and that holds the caste in place. The eighth pillar is one of inherent superiority. Uh, the blacks could not have better homes, better clothes than the whites, so there were all sorts of maneuvers to make sure that they were kind of kept in their place, and the whole example of redlining and not giving mortgages, that whole sense of not wanting to create this equality, that there was a superiority of the whites over the blacks. The same with the Delts, the untouchables in India. Again, this system that we had in India, we see parallels very much with that in America. Simple example, if a white was coming down the sidewalk, the black would have to get off the sidewalk because they weren't allowed to be on the same sidewalk with the white person. Blacks, for example, would have to pay in the front of the bus, but they could only sit in the back of the bus. So they would go to the front of the bus, they would pay the fare, and sometimes that journey from the front of the bus to the back of the bus would pull out. And you would even lose your fare, have to wait for another bus, that type of thing. And so people weren't even able to use public transportation in a reasonable way. A great example of this superiority syndrome was the famous experiment of the third grade teacher, Mrs. Elliott, with her students, and she divided them into the brown eyes and the blue eyes, and the blue eyes would be treated in a preferential way, that they were superior, and you saw the reaction in those that were with the brown eye group and how upset they would get. And then she would change it a few days later, and the brown would become blue, and the same thing would happen among the students. So anytime when one group is treated as superior to another, it has terrible consequences. So you can see that these pillars of caste that were established were meant to keep the whole caste system in place.